Hey guys, welcome to our second week of distance learning. Hopefully, you've had a fantastic week last week. Hopefully, your weekend has been excellent. Hopefully, you're feeling ready to learn today. Today, we're going to delve into the first of two lectures on Egypt. We're going to focus first on ancient Egypt, which is a topic that I am particularly interested in. Then we're going to come back. We're going to talk about more modern Egypt and its relation to the rest of the Middle East, and specifically to Israel, which I think we've already discussed in an in-class discussion at this point. So hopefully you've got some background on that when we get to that lecture. But first, for this lecture, we are talking about the ancient Egyptians and all of the things that they did and the things that they gave to the world that are important. So, ancient Egypt, as you might be aware, is one of the world's oldest civilizations. If we use the world's dating system, they go back to 3,500 BC or so. Obviously, when you factor in the flood, perhaps there's some wiggle room. But suffice to say that the Egyptians are one of the first two major civilizations to come into existence after the Tower of Babel. The first, of course, being the Sumerians, more than likely the people that stayed in the area of the Tower of Babel, and the Egyptians rising up very shortly afterward. The Egyptians live in a very famous location, and that is the Nile River Delta, which is the western part of an area called the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent goes up the Nile. It hugs the coast where modern-day Israel is. It goes across the north of Syria and then comes down the Tigris and Euphrates River. So generally a crescent shape if you were to overlay it on the map. And again, with your computer, I encourage you to look up a map to see exactly where the Fertile Crescent is. The Egyptian civilization is going to be developed on the Nile River, really down its entire length until a series of waterfalls called the cataracts. We typically say that Egyptian civilization ends at the first cataract, not that the Egyptians didn't extend past that, it's just their civilization began north of that point. Also, confusingly, the Nile is famous for having the upper and the lower Nile being the northern part and the upper Nile being the southern part, which is confusing, especially when you consider that Egypt is north of the equator. So it's not even an equator thing. But what it's referring to, of course, is the direction of flow of the Nile. It's one of the only major rivers in the world that flows south to north. So the upper river, the upper part of the river is further south. The lower part of the river is further north. And I know that kind of messes with our American brains, right? It's like the Mississippi. The upper Mississippi is Wisconsin. The lower Mississippi is Louisiana. We're used to that. But the Nile is obviously different. There's also two major parts of the Nile that it's important to keep in your mind, and this is going to apply to modern Egypt, so this is important to note. We have the Nile Delta, which is the area at the end of the river, and we have the long stretch of the Nile River Valley. And oftentimes this river valley is quite small. In fact, if you were to stand on the desert on one side of the valley, you could see across the river to the desert on the other side of the valley. So it's really a very narrow area, although it does widen out at certain spots. The delta of the Nile is actually where we get the entire concept of a delta. If you're unfamiliar with it, delta is actually a character in the Greek alphabet. It's the fourth character, where we obviously get our letter D from, delta, and its capital form is a triangle. Looks something like that, okay? And if you flip that upside down on your map and you look at the green area surrounding the end of the Nile, what you have is a triangular wedge, and hence it is the Nile Delta, okay, named after the shape of the letter. The delta is full of very, very fertile soil, so it seems like that would be where a majority of Egyptian civilization existed. But there's a problem with the delta. It's actually a twofold problem. Number one, because of the unique features of the Nile River, it's actually difficult to build a permanent habitation there. You can farm it, certainly, but once a year, your buildings are probably going to get knocked out. Number two, there's no real good building materials in the delta. The delta is chock full of rich nutrients, which is great for farming. Not so good if you want to build a civilization. On the other hand, the Nile River Valley was still quite fertile, but it also had access to immense amounts of good stone, limestone, sandstone, and granite specifically, and we'll talk about all of those at various points in this lecture. So Egyptian civilization is actually going to grow up in the valley itself, sometimes utilizing the delta, but other times it's not going to utilize the delta whatsoever. So Egyptian history begins with Upper and Lower Egypt being two separate in unique places. And they're actually at war with each other. Sometimes they're referred to as White Egypt and Red Egypt. And this is simply because of the coloration on two crowns of two kings found on a very famous piece of archaeological evidence called the Narmer palette. The Narmer, Narmer palette. Again, if you have your computer, I encourage you to look it up. It's really quite a cool piece. I also seem to think it has dinosaurs on the back. So even if you don't have any interest in Egyptians, there's dinosaurs on it. At least that's my personal interpretation. Tell me what you think those long-necked things are. They certainly don't look like giraffes. But the Narmer palette is actually a victory inscription. And it's a palette, of course, because it was used to mash things together. You can see the little bowl impression on the device. But basically what it's doing is it's telling a story. It's telling the story of the king Narmer, who apparently was a king, and he conquered the Egyptians further south. So the upper Egyptians were conquered by the lower Egyptians, and the Egyptians were unified into a single empire, a single kingdom under King Narmer. And King Narmer is considered the first pharaoh. He's the first guy who rules all of Egypt. And in fact, he takes the two crowns from Upper and Lower Egypt and he combines them into a single crown, and that is the crown of the pharaohs that perhaps you've seen before on Tutankhamun's mask, for example. It's got a snake and an eagle both on it. Okay, there's this symbolism there that you can see if you're interested in it. Again, if you're interested in Egyptian artwork, it's really quite interesting, and I encourage you to research it more if that appeals to you. So Narmer unifies Egypt, but we know almost nothing about him. I mean, that's about it. There is a ceremonial mace that might date from before Narmer, which seems in hieroglyphics to be talking about a guy by the name of the Scorpion King. We're not sure if the rune or the hieroglyph for Scorpion had a pronunciation, so we don't know if he was literally the Scorpion King, as in they were thinking that he was embolized by the scorpion, or that was simply for a phrase like the Ba King. We don't know. But these two artifacts are really the only thing we have from the beginning period. So we're not even sure if Narmer was the Scorpion King, if the Scorpion King came before Narmer, if the Scorpion King was the guy conquered by Narmer. It's really convoluted and confusing. And so the first few dynasties of Egypt are just like that. We know they existed. They didn't really build tombs. They didn't really leave a lot of artifacts that survived. And by the way, the main reason for this, and this is a problem throughout all of Egyptian history, is when you are the pharaoh and you are a little strapped for cash, it's much cheaper to take the guy down the street's pyramid, take it apart, and use those building blocks to build your own. This is going to cause problems again and again and again. This is why the Great Pyramids aren't nice and shiny outside like they were originally designed to be, although that isn't even the Egyptians' fault. The Muslims took all that stuff off in the Middle Ages. But anyway, the point being that many early monuments were taken apart and reassembled somewhere else to fit somebody else's new vision. So it's not that they didn't build anything. It's simply that none of their structures survived, and they probably weren't building things as big as later Egyptians. We really don't hear much from the Egyptians until they begin to change up their burial practices, which is kind of ironic. The reason that we know so much about the Egyptians is because of how they treated their dead. We, therefore, get to know how they treated both the dead and, interestingly enough, the living because of what they put on their walls. We know about 6 or 7 generations, at least how we count them, by 30 years. Remember, people after the flood, at least in my opinion, might have lived much longer. But approximately 200 years or so after Narmer, we start to see our first burial practices. And interestingly enough, these burial practices are very crude, and we call them pit burials. Effectively, what was done is the bodies would be, you would dig a pit, and you would throw the body in, and you would throw salt on top of that, and that's how the process started. Now, the problem is that Egypt has a number of carnivores. It has hyenas, it even has lions, and it has jackals. And the jackals especially were famous for digging down into these pits and pulling people's bones up, which is probably one of the reasons why the god Anubis has a jackal head. He's associated with the bringing back up of the dead, which is an interesting parallel. We can see that the creation that God made informed Egyptian mythology there. The reason that this is interesting, and the reason that we know this in the first place, is that some Egyptians began burying their dead in a very specific place. It's called the Wadi Nitrine, and it is named that because it's the Valley of the Natrine. And natrine is a specific compound of salt, and when you bury a body in that salt, it sucks the moisture out and doesn't allow the body to decay naturally. In fact, it leaves them as a natural mummy. And we can tell very early on that the Egyptians noticed this quality of the natrine, and they began to use use it extensively, and eventually they began exporting the natrine out of the valley, and they began doing different experiments with it. Natural natrine mummifications simply lead to a very contorted and locked up body as the nerves and the digestive juices move the arms around. You just kind of get a fetal position most often. With this process. But the Egyptians make developments to this, and over the next few hundred years, they actually figure out a complicated process of getting all the moisture out of a body. It's a process that takes several months. In fact, some of you, maybe you 12th graders, have seen the documentary on mummification and how that's done. I'm including a link in this week's supplementary material. By the way, fantastic documentary, totally worth your time. Put it on while you do something, bake cookies, play video games. I don't care what it is. Just listen to it. It's really interesting, and I think it will be eye-opening to you if you've never listened to it before. But as time goes on, the Egyptians get better and better at this until eventually they're able to create mummies that can keep facial features and even can keep hair. We have several New Kingdom mummies that we actually have hair on their heads, and the most famous of these, of course, is Ramses the Great. Totally look his mummy up. Like right now, type it in, Ramses the Great mummy. It's really cool because he has flaming red hair. All right. Very, very cool. It kind of looks like Cooper's hair if you've seen my brother's hair, but on a mummy. That's super cool to me. And Ramses, by the way, died like 3,500-ish years ago. Okay, somewhere between 3,000 and 3,500 years ago. It's just crazy to me that that guy still got hair. Obviously he's dead, but still pretty impressive if I do say so myself. So this natrine allows the Egyptians to get more and more advanced in their burial practices. But of course, if you can preserve the body, do you just throw it in a pit? That seems like a waste of resources because, you can't see it, you can't appreciate it. And eventually, the Egyptians clearly decided that that wasn't going to be the case. And of course, religious ideas are developing at the same time. So the Egyptians decide, look, if we're going to preserve the dead in this special way, we ought to have some place to keep them. And that's exactly what they're going to do. They're actually going to begin building tombs, building stone structures that can house the dead. And at first, these are very simple. They're on the surface. But the problem with these is that they tend to fall over, and then, the body inside gets crushed, or they get robbed because they're easy to get into, especially if you're putting valuable goods, which it's clear from the very beginning that the Egyptians were doing. Even in the pit burials, they were burying things with the body. So this is clearly problematic. Now, if you're a peasant, I guess it doesn't matter, right? Your family's probably not going to stay in that same area, or if they do, they can chase the robbers off. But if you're a king and you've got lots of stuff, this is problematic. So the Egyptian royalty, the pharaohs, began thinking. Now, to keep power, the pharaohs had begun telling this story about themselves. They were literally the sons of God, not in the biblical sense. They weren't picking this up from biblical thought, certainly, but to maintain their power, they were literally claiming to be the representatives of the god Ra on earth. And at their death, they became deified and joined the pantheon of Egyptian gods. So to defy the king was literally to defy the gods, the very people that made the sun move and made the flood of the Nile, which, by the way, if you didn't know, is very regular. I think I mentioned that all the way back at the beginning of the year when we talked about the Nile. Because of this, the pharaohs are able to start mobilizing these workers because basically they're God. They say, hey, come do this. And what's the punishment if they don't? Literally divine retribution. That's what the people are thinking. So they're able to leverage huge amounts of labor. Some people estimate as many as 100,000 to 1 million laborers a year for several months. What do you do with this kind of manpower resources? Well, the Egyptians decided they were going to build gigantic tombs. All right. And by the way, I can't appreciate the Egyptians' thought process here. I think as Christians, hopefully, we will have similar thought processes, although I hope you don't enslave a bunch of people to build your tomb bigger. But they were thinking about the next life rather than this life. I think eventually the pharaohs began to drink the Kool-Aid that they were selling, that they were gods. But the thing was that as Egyptian mythology developed, you really needed stuff from this life to have a good next life. Otherwise, you ended up in a place called the Sea of Reeds to wander for eternity, starving and being eaten by crocodiles. And every time you were eaten by a crocodile, you would be put out the other end, and you would wake up again and wander again until you got eaten by a crocodile. Does not sound like a very pleasant place to be. How do you escape this? There's several ways. Number one, have a pure heart. Okay. And in fact, to check that, Anubis would weigh your heart against the weight of the feather of truth. And if you had lived a good and pure life, your heart would weigh less than the feather, and you would then get to basically go and live in the halls of the dead. You wouldn't have to worry about that whole Sea of Reeds. But if you did get sent to the Sea of Reeds, that's when you needed all of your goods. There were magical spells you could inscribe on the walls, which is where we get all of those great tomb paintings. And of course, the goods that were sent with you would be available. And what many people do not know is that in your altars, which if you're a king, you're a god, people ought to be praying to you, all of the offerings left to you also come to you in the Sea of Reeds. And eventually you can go through the Sea of Reeds and you can reach several locations. And that's obviously easier if you're well provisioned. Some pharaohs are literally buried with boats so that they can sail through the Sea of Reeds to get to wherever they're going, especially since they're gods. They might not want to live with Anubis. They might be going other places, so they need lots of goods. The temples get bigger and bigger. The tombs get larger and larger. The first major pyramid is called the Step Pyramid of Djoser, built by a vizier by the name of Imhotep. He's a great architect. And he gets this idea of taking these small, squat structures that had been being built as tombs and stacking a bunch of them on top of each other. And by doing this, he was able to create a very large structure, which is held up remarkably well, considering the thing's almost 3,000 years old. 5,000 years old. Add 2,000 years to that, 5,000 years old. If you haven't seen that, look it up. Step Pyramid of Djoser, Djoser. It's very interesting. Step Pyramid of Djoser is pretty good, but people say, well, that design's nice, but I think I can do better. The guy who really thinks he can do better is a pharaoh by the name of Snefu, and Snefu is going to build not one, not two, but 3 pyramids. And I think if you took world history with me last year, you're familiar with this. His first pyramid is called the Broken Pyramid, which I'll let you take a wild guess. It didn't work. The next pyramid is called the Bent Pyramid, which would have been a massive pyramid. The problem is that he didn't have the angles right. He had a 55-degree angle rather than a 45-degree angle. And the problem is that the stone actually collapses by the time you've built the thing up. And so it didn't work. Fortunately, they caught the problem before the thing fell apart or the project had to be scratched. And so what they did is they went to a very shallow angle to finish the project. I think it's between 35 and 40 degrees. Maybe it's like 37 or something like that. And so they finished it, but the pyramid has this distinct bend in the thing, and that's not perfection. Obviously, if you're a self-respecting pharaoh, you can't get buried there. So he moves on to build his third one, and this is called the Red Pyramid. It's not very big compared to his other 2 projects, would have been much larger, but it is a perfect pyramid. It's built correctly, and Snefu dies and is buried there. Unfortunately, his body was destroyed or stolen at some other point, so we don't have him around anymore, unfortunately, but his pyramid does still remain, the Red Pyramid. Now, Snefu's successors are the ones that build the Great Pyramids. And of course, the most famous of the Great Pyramids is built by Khufu. He's sometimes known by his Greek name of Cheops. And he's going to build the Great Pyramid, the largest of the 3 pyramids on the Giza Plateau. It's this massive, massive complex. And he is going to be buried down in the heart of the thing with incredibly elaborate tunnels and tombs to get in there. His queens and his royal family is going to be buried there as well. And there's going to be a huge royal complex where you can come and worship him. It is clear that the tomb actually lasted a long time. In fact, by the time of Herodotus in 500 BC, 2,000 years later, it's not clear whether the tomb had been robbed or not. By the 700s AD, we know it had been, but I personally believe that the tomb actually remained intact until after Herodotus visited. So his tomb was intact for at least 2,000 years. That's pretty impressive. The outer facade of the pyramid was built of this beautiful white limestone, and on top we have a gilded golden triangle stuck on the top. And this imagery of the pyramid is incredibly impressive, by the way. If you've got a $1 bill in your wallet, pull it out. There's the Great Pyramid. It's got this eye complex on the top, but that top thing was the gold topper. And when the sun hit that, it looked like an eye looking down. At least that's what people thought. I don't know if that's like the eye of Sauron looking down on you if you've seen Lord of the Rings, but there was some kind of eye effect that it had when it got hit by the sun, and hence eventually it got into popular culture. Perhaps you're familiar with that pyramid with the eye on it as the Illuminati symbol, but actually it reflects the reality of the building. Next to it, we have the Great Pyramid of Khafre. If you see this thing in photographs, it looks bigger than the Great Pyramid, so that's a That's if you're ever looking at the pyramid plateau, the Great Pyramid's probably not the one that looks tallest. There's a trick going on there. It's actually built on a higher shelf of limestone, elevates the pyramid by about 45 feet. It's actually about 30 feet shorter than the Great Pyramid. So it looks taller, but it's not, in fact, actually taller. Built by the grandson of Khufu, Khafre. And again, similar situation. We're not sure when that one was broken into. Also, limestone facade with some kind of topper. We're not sure if it was gold or not. It's not mentioned in our sources. Finally, we have a third pyramid built on the Giza Plateau by Khafre's grandson, who I don't actually know the name of off the top of my head, so you should look that up, who the three pyramids belong to. But this is a much smaller pyramid by far. And if you look at a picture of the Giza Plateau, you can clearly see the two larger pyramids and this much smaller pyramid. Now, the entire place around the pyramids are filled with different buildings, temples so that you can offer goods to the dead pharaohs, and most famously, a odd statue. Okay, and what is that odd statue? I'll give you a second to think about it, see if you can figure it out. Of course, it is the Sphinx, which is a man's face, a pharaoh's face, and on that is a lion's body. And this structure has fascinated people because it's very mysterious. We're not clear who built it. Was it built with the original pyramids or was it not? Now, we can pretty definitively say who the face belongs to. It's probably Ramses the Great's face. And you might go, wait a second, we don't know who built it, but we do know whose face is on it. Yeah, so when Ramses came to power, he basically looked at every monument in Egypt and said, yeah, that was actually mine. And so what he would do is he would tell his stonemasons to chip off the last pharaoh's name and put his name on there, but carve it so deep that you'd have to break the monument to get it off. So Ramses took credit for everything from the pyramids to the Sphinx to just about every other monument in Egypt, despite the fact that we know for a fact he didn't build most of them, but his name's all over them. That being said, many people believe, and this is indicated by some stone chippings that have been found around the Sphinx, that there was originally a much further face on it, perhaps even a lion face, and that was chipped off, and what remains is a likeness of the pharaoh Ramses, who of course has lost his nose. That's actually a fairly recent development, but unlike what the myth says, Napoleon didn't shoot it off with a cannon, although Napoleon did actually watch a battle from the top of the pyramids. In fact, Napoleon makes this great quote that I totally would have showed you if we'd had class, where he says something like, tonight, men, the weight of 4,000 years of history looks down upon you, when he's trying to inspire his men for the upcoming battle, pointing over at the pyramids. Really cool set piece for a battle, if you ask me. Moving on from the pyramid builders, the rest of what's called the Old Kingdom, which is the first group that controlled Egypt, is really uneventful. There's still some pyramid building, but it goes much further down in scale for two reasons. Number one, the pharaohs simply couldn't leverage the manpower. It seems like when the pharaohs built the biggest of the pyramids, there was incredible harvests in Egypt. There was lots of food. It was easy to get people out to go do work because they were already fed. And that seems to go down. There's famine more often than not, and nobody can get all of these guys out to come build them gigantic tombs anymore. It also appears that the engineering quality went down. And this could be because the Giza Plateau is actually very, very incredibly good for building massive structures. There's really nowhere else in Egypt that could support the kind of weight that those things had. But another reason is I think the information was simply lost. Egyptian language is not one that is good for recording technical information. In fact, it wasn't until Greek came around that any language of the Middle East or Europe could really record information well. Think about trying to record a complex scientific formula in cuneiform or hieroglyphics. It's really just not possible. And so that information has to be passed down father to son, father to son, father to son. And if somebody dies in there or somebody, misremembers what their father said, we actually have a reduction in information. And by the way, can I tell you that humans have had this problem for much longer than we haven't had this problem? People without access to high quality books and recordings really do have a disadvantage. Because think about it. Let's say that during your time off for these next 2 weeks, possibly this entire quarter, you decided you wanted to go out and you wanted to complete some project. Let's just say that you wanted to go build yourself a treehouse. Okay. Now, you have a couple options. You could talk to your dad. Maybe he knows how to build a treehouse. But what if he doesn't? What if he doesn't know how to build a treehouse? Well, maybe your grandfather, maybe a family friend, or you could go to the library if it's open. It's not open right now. So you can go to the internet instead and you can look up how to build a treehouse. And it will tell you how to build a treehouse, probably in exact details, probably a lot of different ways to build a treehouse, some of which may be good and some of which may be bad. We almost have a different problem today. We have to be discerning about which information to believe, but we have the information. And that is actually incredibly important because if someone were to die today that knew how to do something, more than likely how to do that is still present in their writings, in books, in videos of them. Totally different than most of human society. Sorry, really distracted there, not really on point for the Egyptians. So we have the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom goes down approximately 2000, 1800 BC or so. The dates on ancient Egypt are all noodly, and obviously most of these are coming out of a worldly perspective, so it's hard to be certain on the dates. They just kind of pick arbitrary dates and then try and defend them. I don't know that there's a lot of great evidence one way or the other. We then have what's called an intermediate period. In my personal opinion, this is the most likely time for the Israelites to have been in Egypt. The intermediate period saw a division between Upper and Lower Egypt again, and a massive invasion by a group from the Middle East area that invaded and took over Egypt. And that group occupied the northern part of Egypt and kind of established their own line of pharaohs. And more than likely, based on the place names given us in the Bible, things like Pith-Ramses and Goshen, it's more than likely that the Israelites were in this northern part of Israel, and it would simply make sense that that group controlled them, especially since we have these references to Joseph being popular with the Pharaoh, and then there's a Pharaoh that doesn't know Joseph. Well, how does that happen? Well, perhaps Joseph was serving a actual Egyptian pharaoh, and then one of these foreign usurpers shows up and he conquers these Israelites, and he doesn't know anything about them. What do I do with these people? I don't know why they're important, and so we have the confusion that we see there in the Bible. And I'm looking up the name of those people because I cannot remember for the life of me what they're called. All right, let's find out. It is the bummer. I cannot find it. Apologize, guys. I should have looked this up beforehand. Oh, let's see. Let's see. Anyway, I'll post a link to it because I cannot find it off the top of my head. Wow, that is a surprise. I think they're called the Hypsis. I seem to remember, but clearly I can't pull it up on Wikipedia, and if it's not on Wikipedia, it must not exist. So anyway, I apologize about that delay. Hopefully you didn't turn the video off while I was trying to find it. Anyway, I'll post a link. So anyway, this group comes in. They get kicked out of power by a new dynasty that arose in Upper Egypt, led by Menenhotep II, and he establishes the Middle Kingdom, or the Middle Dynasty of Egypt. That's all we need to know about the Middle Dynasty of Egypt. Nothing. We have a second intermediate period where there's division between the North and the South. In fact, we have divisions between almost everybody. There's 32 separate pharaohs and states that rise up. We don't have time to get into it, but eventually several invasions occur, and the Egyptians throw off these foreign invasions, and we have a final dynasty that emerges, and this is the New Kingdom pharaohs. The New Kingdom pharaohs are the ones that are most famous for their mummies because they survived. The process of mummification was not new. It was old at that time, but the fact that the mummies survived is what's particularly impressive. And we have a number of really good mummies because the Egyptians worked hard to protect these, and many of them were destroyed in tomb robbing incidents. But the priests who were assigned to protect the Valley of the Kings, where most of these mummies were, did a fantastic job of moving them around to protect them. They basically consolidated the mummies in certain tombs and the grave goods in other tombs. And of course, the grave goods got stolen, but the mummies were largely left alone. Some of them were defaced as people were ripping jewelry off of them, but really, in general, it wasn't that much of a problem. The most famous mummy, of course, of all time, and you're probably surprised I haven't gotten to him yet, is, of course, Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun is a super interesting guy. I think I am going to post several links to Tutankhamun, his father Akhenaten, and all of the wonderfully complex stuff that I wish I had time to go into. Oh man, I wish this was real history. We would talk about Akhenaten and Tutankhamun for several lectures because they're so interesting. But that's okay. We don't have time to talk about him. Tutankhamun is of interest to us because while he did almost nothing as a pharaoh, he was buried in an unusual location in the Valley of the Kings. He was buried kind of at the bottom, and by chance, a flash flood swept debris into the entrance chamber of his tomb, burying it and making it completely invisible to raiders. And for the next 3,000 years, no one disturbed Tutankhamun until 1922, when a British historian and archaeologist unearthed the tomb and went in. And not only did we find Tutankhamun, but we found a complete grave good collection, something we had never found in the history of Egyptology. Tutankhamun's tomb is probably the most interesting archaeological discovery of all time, and I think that's probably pretty lofty, but I really think it's true. If you've never seen Tutankhamun's mask, at the very least, please look it up. I'll post links to some documentaries on him if you want to watch those, because I think it is absolutely fascinating. Now, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap this up. I could keep talking for probably several more hours about ancient Egypt, but I think I've gotten everything that I really need to cover. Do realize that Egyptian history continues all the way into the time of the Roman Empire. The native Egyptians kind of lose power, though, in the 800s or so. They're conquered by foreign groups controlled by the Sudanese and the Libyans. Eventually, they're conquered by the Persians. Actually, backing up, they're conquered by the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Greeks. Then they're ruled by a Greek dynasty, all of which male kings called themselves Ptolemy, so that's easy to remember, Ptolemy 1 through Ptolemy 15. Cleopatra is famously part of this line, had a son with Julius Caesar, had several sons with Mark Antony, and was killed herself rather after her battle with Octavian. And of course, Egypt is then absorbed into the Roman Empire. From there, Egypt is going to go into the Muslim world in the Middle Ages, but we will have that discussion in our next lecture.